It is uncommon for a ship's crew to have completely vanished without any sign of struggle or peril, and for the ship to be able to continue on adrift in near perfect condition.
It is unprecedented to discover a ship adrift in open ocean with its entire crew missing and its cargo undamaged without any indication of struggle.
The sails were damaged. Those that were up and had not been furled were damaged. Aside from that, there was no real structural damage to the boat.
The Mary Celeste has been the most well-known riddle in the seas for 150 years. No bodies, no blood, and no obvious reason. However, new research ultimately revealed the truth in 2025. Furthermore, the reality is far more terrifying than the legend. The day Mary Celeste became a ghost ship. A small British freight ship named the Di Gracia was navigating the North Atlantic in early December of 1872. The crew noticed another sailing ship ahead of them, moving suspiciously. The seas were choppy, and the sky was cloudy. It was not maintaining a stable trajectory. Signals went unanswered. Nobody called back or waved from the deck. Something didn't feel right for sailors who lived their entire lives seeing other ships from a distance. The soldiers could read the name on the stern of the other ship as the Di Gracia got closer. It was the Mary Celeste, an American sailing ship that had sailed to Genoa, Italy, from New York almost a month prior, loaded with industrial alcohol. A brigantine, or small two-masted freight ship with a combination of square and 4.5 sails, was what the Mary Celeste was. She didn't appear broken from a distance. Some of her sails were damaged and loose, but overall they were set. In the water, the hull continued to ride rather high. There were no overt signs of combat or storm damage. At this point, the two ships were about 400 meters east of the Azores, a collection of islands located midway between North America and Europe in the middle of the Atlantic. It was dangerous to locate a ship in those locations with no one responding. There could yet be time to assist if Mary Celeste had been struck by an unexpected calamity. The Di Gracia's captain David Mohouse concluded that he could not simply walk by and wish for the best. He gave the order for a small group to row over and get on board the unusual ship. After ascending the side, the boarding party entered a quiet deck. There was no one on the wheel. The ropes were not twisted, but they were also not properly coiled. A few sails continued to catch wind. Some were flapping or partially broken, as though they had been neglected for days instead of being torn apart in a single, powerful storm. There was no sign of the kind of mayhem you would anticipate if a massive wave or fire had suddenly swept over that upper level. The image only became more bizarre when the men descended. Although they discovered a few feet of water in the hold, it was insufficient for a ship that size to sink. There was still plenty of fresh water and food, enough for several more weeks at sea. There were crates and barrels. The 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol that made up the load were nearly entirely undisturbed. Clothes, boots, pipes, maps, and other modest personal belongings were still in the captain's cabin. There was no indication that someone had hurriedly packed or attempted to take valuables before departing. The men were immediately troubled by one detail. Mary Celeste's only tiny boat, a yacht that served as a lifeboat, vanished. There was a neat tackle and empty space where it ought to have hung from its davits. Instead of being carried away by a wave, it appeared as though the boat had been intentionally lowered. It appeared as though someone had removed some of the navigational aids into that tiny boat, and the ship's primary compass had been tampered with. However, no debris or floating fragments of a destroyed lifeboat were in the vicinity. They were surrounded by an empty sea. The boarding party discovered the logbook in the chart room. The ship was located close to the island of Santa Maria, one of the Azores, according to the most recent unambiguous entry, which was dated late November, roughly 10 days earlier. The Mary Celeste was currently floating about 400 miles west of that location. To put it another way, for around a week and a half, the ship had been able to sail or drift without anyone at the helm or updating the log. A fatal storm or a ship on the verge of failure were not included in the weather notes in those final entries. Up until the writing ceased, everything on the paper appeared normal. The Di Gracia crew stayed long enough to make sure they hadn't overlooked any injured or hiding people. No bodies were present. There were no shattered weapons, bullet holes, or bloodstains. Hatches and doors were opened, but not broken. The ship's pump, which was used to remove water from the hold, had been disassembled. Nobody on the boarding team could pinpoint the precise reason. It wasn't in functioning order, but it also didn't appear to be a hurried fix. On a ship full of little, pointed inquiries, it was simply another riddle. This was no ghost story to the crew of the DEI Gracia. It was a real-world issue. Now, they had a big, seemingly sound ship floating in a crowded sea route without a crew. They may claim a salvage award if they took the chance to bring this ship to port, according to the norms of the sea. That is a portion of the ship's worth, given as compensation for preventing the loss of property. Captain Mohouse made the decision to divide his own small crew between the two vessels. A few would remain on the DEI Gracia. The Mary Celeste would be sailed by others. The two would go together to the closest large port so that a court could resolve the matter. The journey to Gibraltar was stressful and lengthy. It was about 800 meters away. Strange feelings of discomfort were observed by the men sailing the empty ship. Working on a ship where there's a lot of noise and conversation is one thing. Standing watch on. Peaceful decks surrounded by the possessions of people who ought to be there, but aren't, is quite another. The British authorities handled the situation as more than just a salvage claim when they arrived in Gibraltar in the middle of December. A unique maritime court, known as a Vice Admiral Court, existed in the port. It was responsible for managing legal issues pertaining to ships, cargo, and maritime events. Frederick Sully Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar, was the main authority involved in the case. He had a suspicion from the beginning that something illegal had occurred, either between the two groups of seamen or on the Mary Celeste. The ship was thoroughly examined by inspectors. They took another measurement of the water in the hold. They attempted to determine whether the tiny markings on the bow came from tools or the sea. They counted the barrels, examined the cargo, and noted whether ones were empty or damaged. They looked for evidence of violence or fire in the ship's fittings and timbers. Ultimately, they were unable to establish any fraud, murder, or attack. Other than bringing in an abandoned ship, there was no obvious indication that the DI Gracia's crew had done anything. However, Siflud's misgivings persisted, and his inquiries kept the subject in the public eye. How much money to give the salvors was still up to the court to decide. Mary Celeste was valuable, as was her cargo. Rescuers may get a sizable portion in many comparable situations, particularly if they risk their own ship and life to bring in a drifting vessel. In this instance, the court awarded around $1,700, roughly 15% of the total insured value, much less than most people had anticipated. These figures implied that the judges thought the rescuers should have received compensation. However, the entire situation was still clouded by that mistrust. Mary Celeste herself sat in harbor, restrained and silent, while the court case unfolded. Her journey began over 10 years ago at a little shipyard in the Nova Scotian town of Spencer's Island. Her keel was put down by local builders in 1860, and she was launched under the name Amazon in 1861. She was constructed from local wood and was roughly 100 feet in length and somewhat more than 25 feet in width. She suffered a few minor mishaps in the beginning, such as a collision in the English Channel and a grounding when returning from a cruise, but nothing that would have identified her as dangerous or cursed. The ship was later sold to Americans after being damaged and laid up, and it was renamed Mary Celeste. She had a significant refurbishment in New York at the beginning of the 1870s. Her owners strengthened her frame and added a second deck for about $10,000. She grew to a little over 280 tons as a result of the work. More room allowed for more cargo, but it also made the ship's interior deeper and more intricate. She returned to the water looking stronger and newer after numerous timbers were replaced. Then came a new job: load almost 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, transport them to Genoa securely, and make money for her owners. One thing was evident at the end of the Gibraltar salvage hearing. This was not the wreck of Mary Celeste herself. The folks who had abandoned her in the middle of the ocean and never returned were the story's true flaw. The next thing that everyone needed to comprehend was that gap, those 10 missing lives. How the rumor got out of hand and the individuals who disappeared. Mary Celeste was just a tiny working ship carrying a genuine family and a small number of sailors who expected to go out, do their tasks, and return home before it became a ghost ship tale. When you learn who these individuals were, the mystery starts to feel much less like a horror film and more like a terrible choice made by regular people who were never given another chance. Benjamin Spooner Briggs, the captain, came from a long family of sea captains and was raised in Massachusetts. Nearly all of the men in his family were at sea. He was around 37 years old, a master mariner with years of experience navigating the Atlantic, when he assumed command of the Mary Celeste in 1872. People who sailed with him later regarded him as steady, fair, and quiet. He wasn't the type of man who would risk his people or his ship. Briggs was more than this ship's employee. Along with James Winchester, the primary owner, he had contributed his personal savings to a portion of the Mary Celeste. That means his money, his career, and his reputation were bound to this one hull. You don't invest in a ship and then decide to abandon it in the middle of the sea. In addition, despite the fact that his ship had a hold full of wine, he abstained from drinking due to his strong religious beliefs. He read the Bible, took his faith seriously, and led a calm, predictable life while on land, according to friends and later writers. He and his spouse wrote to his mother back home from New York just prior to the journey. He wrote that their ship was well trimmed and expressed his wish for a smooth journey. Simple words that convey assurance rather than dread. A year prior, he had even considered coming onshore to start a business with his brother instead of staying at sea. However, both men ultimately decided to continue serving as captains and make investments in different ships. That decision only makes sense if he anticipated many more typical journeys rather than a planned disappearance. Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, his wife, knew exactly what she was getting herself into when she got married. She was a minister's daughter and had previously traveled extensively with Benjamin, including on an Atlantic honeymoon cruise. She was described in family letters as being composed and competent, someone who did not panic easily, and someone who understood what it would be like to spend months at sea. Mary Celeste and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia boarded the ship when it was being loaded in New York in late 1872, transforming what could have been a routine business trip into a family journey to Italy. You may see what their lives were like during those final days in the port. While the ship was waiting for the weather to improve close to Staten Island, Sarah wrote her mother-in-law one last letter. She asked her to let their son Arthur know that she was looking forward to his letters and that she would make an effort to recall details from the trip that he would find interesting. In order for Arthur, who was around 7 years old, to attend school, his grandmother had left him in Massachusetts. When parents are going to pretend to be dead or flee from their lives, that is not what they do. Parents do this when they are certain they will return. The remaining passengers weren't anonymous extras. First mate Albert G. Richardson was a 28-year-old American sailor who had previously sailed with Briggs. He was a reliable option because he was related to the owner's family. Andrew Gilling, the second mate, was a mid-20-something New Yorker of Danish ancestry. Edward William Head, the cook and steward, was a young, recently married American in his early 20s. These were not drifters dragged off the pier at the last minute. Rather, these were men with genuine ties on shore. German sailors from the Fian Islands off the north coast of Europe made up the remaining 4 crew members. German sailors from the Fian Islands off the north coast of Europe made up the remaining 4 crew members. Arian Martins, Gotadal Goodshaw, and the brothers Volkert and Boy Lurin. They were first-class sailors and seasoned, peaceful men who were not notorious troublemakers, according to records from Europe and subsequent studies. The majority of these individuals had property or family back home. Briggs was picky about who he hired, and he expressed his satisfaction with the ship and crew in a letter to his mother. According to Sarah, the men appeared composed and capable of carrying on as they had started. Therefore, the discovery of a ship without a crew was not the only shock when the empty Mary Celeste arrived at Gibraltar. It was that 7 selected seamen, a well-known captain, his wife, and their young daughter had all disappeared at the same moment. A New York trade paper's initial report claimed that the entire affair smelled of foul play and implied that alcohol was to blame. This claim would be repeated and misrepresented for years. The Gibraltar court did little to defuse the situation. Frederick C. Flood, the local attorney general, was certain that dishonesty had occurred despite his inability to establish any criminal activity. His inquiries throughout the hearings and some of his remarks to others indicated that he thought the Mary Celeste silent decks might be the scene of either a murder or a financial plot. And that's where the mystery of the Mary Celeste becomes even more chilling. Not because of ghosts, but because real people vanished without leaving a single trace. No violence, no wreckage, no storm, just 10 souls who stepped off a perfectly good ship and were never seen again. So now I want to hear from you. What do you believe happened out there in the middle of the Atlantic? Was it panic? A terrible mistake? A freak accident? Or something darker that history never uncovered? Drop your theories in the comments. I'm reading all of them. And if you love deep dive mysteries like this one, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap into the next video right here, because we've got more unbelievable stories coming your way. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next one.